The Galactic Council declared war on humanity. She only smiled and whispered, "Finally." The vote was already done before I walked into the chamber. I knew it before the doors opened. I could feel it in the way the guards stepped aside a little too quickly, the way the junior diplomatic aides avoided my eyes as I passed through the corridor. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when 847 civilizations have just decided to end yours. I had studied that silence for 17 years. I recognized it immediately. The Grand Chamber of Veilthorn Prime is built to make you feel small. That is its entire purpose. The ceiling rises 400 meters above the floor, carved from a single piece of pale stone quarried from the heart of a dead world. The seats curve upward in massive arcs, filled with the representatives of species that had been traveling among the stars before humanity had invented writing. The lighting is cool and blue and it falls from sources you can never quite locate, which means you are always standing in a kind of calculated dimness while everything above you glows. I walked to the center of the floor, where the human delegation platform sat, a small raised disc barely 3 meters across, which was itself a deliberate design choice. Every non-member species that came before the council stood on a small disc. It reminded you of your place. Archon Thelavar of the Velhari Continuum was already speaking when I arrived. He did not pause for me. That was another deliberate choice. His species communicated through layered harmonic tones, and the translation feed in my earpiece rendered his words in flat, precise English. He was reading from the Declaration. It was a long document. The council had been writing it for 2 years, though they had been planning it for longer than that. I sat down. My aide, a young man named Oliver, leaned toward me from his seat just behind the platform. He was 26 years old, sharp-minded, and had a habit of tapping his left thumb against his knee when he was nervous. He was tapping it now at a considerable speed. "Admiral," he whispered, "they have finished the count." "I know," I said. 847-0. "I know, Oliver." The Archon's voice rolled through the chamber. The charges were being read. I had memorized them months ago, but I listened anyway, because I believed in knowing the exact shape of things. Charge 1, humanity had terraformed the world designated Kareth 7 without council authorization. The planet had been listed as a protected ecological reserve under galactic preservation law for 600 years. What the charge did not mention was that the colony ship carrying 11,000 humans had suffered a catastrophic engine failure 18 months into its journey. Kareth 7 had been the only world within range with breathable atmosphere and liquid water. The colony had been starving. They had planted crops. They had survived. The council had fined them for it. Charge 2, humanity had refused to decommission its orbital defense platforms in 3 separate star systems, in direct violation of the Tier 3 species armament limitations outlined in the council charter. What the charge did not mention was that those 3 systems had each been attacked. The first time, by pirates operating with equipment that could only have come from a Tier 5 supplier. The second time, by a fleet that matched no registered species registry, a fleet that conveniently dissolved when human ships arrived to investigate. The third time, by forces that the council had later classified as an internal dispute, sealing all records. Humans had built the platforms because no one else was going to protect them. Charge 3, humanity had developed and deployed weapons technology classified beyond the permitted scope for a Tier 3 civilization. Specifically, the council cited what their analysts had called the Vandermeer field, a method of disrupting hyperspace transit corridors, as evidence of illegal advancement. I almost smiled at that one. The Vandermeer field had been developed by a physicist named Claire Vandermeer, a woman who had spent 30 years working in a research station on the edge of known space with exactly no military funding and 3 graduate students. She had published her findings openly. The council had classified them. The charges continued. 12 in total. Each one technically accurate. Each one carefully stripped of the context that explained why humans had done what they had done. I listened to all of it. I did not shift in my seat. I did not check my datapad. I looked at Archon Thelavar with the same expression I might give a window on a cloudy day, patient, neutral, entirely unmoved. When he finished reading, the chamber fell quiet. It was the kind of quiet that had weight to it. 847 species were watching me from their tiered seats, and most of them were waiting for me to speak. To object. To argue. To appeal. The council loved appeals. Appeals meant you accepted their authority. Appeals meant you were still playing their game by their rules. Thelivar turned his great pale eyes toward me. His species had 4 of them, arranged in a horizontal line across a face that had no other features a human would recognize as a face. The translation feed caught his next words before he had fully finished speaking. Admiral Commander Voss. The Council invites the human representative to offer a formal response to the declaration before the final record is sealed. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked down at my datapad, opened a single pre-written message, and pressed send. The message was 12 words. It went to 41 recipients simultaneously, in 11 different star systems. Each of those recipients had been waiting for it, in some cases for years. I set the datapad face down on my knee and looked back up at Thelivar. The human delegation acknowledges receipt of the declaration, I said. My voice was calm and clear, and it carried easily through the chamber without amplification. I had practiced that particular tone for a long time. I paused. Then I smiled. It was not a large smile. It was quiet. It was the smile of someone who has just watched the last piece of a very long and complicated puzzle click into place. It was the smile of someone who has been waiting for a door to open and has heard the handle turn. Thelivar stared at me. I could not read alien expressions well, but I had spent enough time among the Velhari to recognize the particular stillness that indicated confusion. Oliver had gone completely rigid behind me. He had stopped tapping his knee. I leaned slightly toward him, just enough that only he could hear me, and I said 2 words very quietly. Finally, I whispered. Send it. I could hear his breath catch. Then I heard the soft sound of his own datapad activating. The chamber was still watching me. They were expecting something. A protest. An announcement. Perhaps tears. I had read the Council's psychological assessments of human leadership responses to extreme pressure. They had predicted, with great confidence, that the human representative would show visible signs of emotional distress within 4 minutes of the declaration being read. They had based this on their experience with every other species that had ever stood on that small disk. They did not yet understand that they had never met a species quite like us. I sat back in my chair and waited. Thelivar asked if I had any further statement to enter into the record. No, I said. He asked if humanity wished to petition for a delay in the implementation timeline. No, I said. He asked if humanity would like to request a mediating body for the transition. No, I said. He paused. Then he said, with what I thought was a flicker of uncertainty in his harmonics, then the declaration stands. This session is closed. The chamber began to empty slowly, the way large formal rooms do, bodies moving toward exits, voices rising in hundreds of languages. It had the texture of a performance ending. I stood up from the platform. Oliver fell into step beside me. The confirmations are coming in, he said quietly, his voice very controlled. All 41. Good, I said. Are you sure about this? He asked. He was not asking because he doubted the plan. He was asking because he was 26 years old and this was the largest thing he had ever been part of, and when you are 26 and standing at the edge of something that enormous, you need someone to tell you it is real. I looked at him. I have been sure, I said, for 17 years. We walked toward the exit. Behind us, the grand chamber of Veilthorn Prime grew quiet. The light stayed cool and blue. The ceiling stretched upward in its old, calculated magnificence. I did not look back. The Archon mistook my smile for madness. He would understand the difference soon enough. There is a particular sound that deep space construction makes. It is not loud. It is a low, steady vibration that moves through metal and into your bones, a kind of mechanical breathing that never stops. I spent 3 years living inside that sound, in a place the official records listed only as Installation 7, at a set of coordinates that existed in no public navigation database. The installation was built inside a hollowed asteroid roughly 9 kilometers wide, in a system with no habitable worlds and no reason for anyone to visit. The outside looked exactly like every other rock in that part of space, cold, scarred, unremarkable. The inside was something else entirely. When I first arrived, 12 years ago, the construction teams had already been there for 5 years. They had carved out a space large enough to hold 4 city blocks side by side, sealed it, pressurized it, and filled it with machinery that hummed in every direction at once. There were no windows. The only natural light anyone ever saw was in the greenhouses on level 4, where they grew food under carefully calibrated solar lamps. The director of Installation 7 was a man named Henry Cole. He was 60 years old when I met him, compact and unhurried, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending decades in environments where panic is the most dangerous thing a person can bring into the room. He had white hair that he kept very short and dark eyes that looked at everything with the same careful attention, whether he was examining a technical blueprint or watching you drink your coffee. "You are Admiral Voss," he said when I stepped off the transport. "I am," I said. "Good," he said. "Come and see what your government has been building." What my government had been building, it turned out, was the largest covert military and industrial infrastructure project in human history. It did not start as a war plan. I want to be clear about that, because the distinction matters. When the first seeds of Project Ardent were planted, they were planted by people who genuinely hoped they would never need to use what they were building. The plan was called Ardent because the woman who proposed it, a retired strategic analyst named Patricia Howell, believed in being clear about the nature of things. Ardent meant burning. Ardent meant committed beyond the point of easy withdrawal. She chose the name because she wanted everyone who worked on the project to understand what they were agreeing to. Patricia Howell had watched the Council glass a colony world called Shorvith 9 years before Project Ardent began. She had watched it from a monitoring station with a long-range visual feed, the same way most of the galaxy had watched it, in silence, at a distance, because the Council had already made very clear what happened to species that protested Council compliance actions. 800 million people had lived on Shorvith. They had been there for 3 generations. They had built cities and schools and parks. They had a music tradition that their neighbors said was unlike anything else in the known galaxy. The Council had classified their resource extraction activities as illegal under Section 44 of the Colonial Management Charter, issued a single warning, and then sent a fleet. It took 11 hours. The monitoring feed cut out after the 3rd hour. Patricia Howell had watched those 3 hours without moving. Then she had gone home, sat at her kitchen table for a long time, and begun writing a document that would eventually run to 4,000 pages. I read all 4,000 pages in my first month at Installation 7. Henry gave me a private reading room and a pot of coffee and told me to take as much time as I needed. What Patricia had written was not a war plan. It was an architecture. It was the detailed structural design of a position, the position humanity needed to be in so that if the Council ever decided to come for us, we would not be standing on a platform watching our charges read to us with nothing in our hands. The first element was ships. Not warships in the conventional sense, the Council monitored our registered naval construction closely. What Henry's teams were building at Installation 7 and 8 other facilities spread across remote systems were what the official internal documents called rapid deployment platforms. Each one was roughly the size of a heavy freight hauler, registered in the transport manifests of a dozen different legitimate shipping companies, and designed to convert from cargo configuration to full combat configuration in under 4 hours. The conversion was automated. You pressed a sequence, and the hull reconfigured itself, the weapon systems deployed from their concealed housing, the engine modes shifted from economical to performance. There were 4,000 of them. I stood in the main assembly bay on my 3rd day at Installation 7 and I looked at the rows of gray-hulled vessels extending back into the artificial distance and I did not say anything for a long time. Henry stood beside me. He had the good sense not to fill the silence. "How long have these been here?" I asked eventually. "The first batch, 9 years," he said. "We add roughly 200 per year. The construction rate has been increasing." "Do the Council's monitoring systems know about this facility?" "No," he said simply. "We had a physicist named Claire Vandermeer develop a method of interfering with long-range hyperspace sensor sweeps. The Council classified her research when she published it, which was very convenient for us, since it meant they couldn't openly use her findings either." I looked at him. "The Vandermeer field. Among its applications, yes," he almost smiled. She was quite unhappy when they classified it. She had meant it as pure science. But she came around, once we explained what we were doing. The ships were only one element. The second was infrastructure, the kind that would allow humanity to sustain a long conflict without relying on Council-aligned supply routes. Hidden fuel and resource caches distributed across 42 systems. Self-sustaining manufacturing stations small enough to be mobile. Medical facilities that could be assembled in under a day. Communication networks that used frequencies and encoding methods that the Council's intelligence apparatus had never seen and therefore could not monitor. The third element was something Henry called the long memory. It was a database, the most comprehensive analysis of Council military history, tactics, strategy, and decision-making that had ever been assembled. Patricia Howell had spent 5 years building the first version of it, and teams of analysts had been expanding it ever since. It covered every conflict the Council had participated in over the past 800 years. Every engagement. Every strategic choice. Every pattern. The Council had been fighting wars for a very long time. They had developed habits. Habits meant predictability. Predictability, in the hands of someone paying close attention, was a weakness. But the fourth element was the one that I came to think of as the heart of Project Ardent. It had no official name in the documents. Henry called it simply the network. The Council was not universally loved among its own members. The Council presented itself as a unified interstellar community, but in practice, it was a hierarchy. The oldest and most powerful species sat at the top and made most of the actual decisions. The newer or smaller or less economically significant species filled the seats and voted and attended the ceremonies, but their influence on anything that truly mattered was minimal. The Council called this a merit-based structure. The species who had been living under it for generations called it other things, usually in private. Over 17 years, human representatives had been quietly moving through the outer and middle-tier worlds. Not as diplomats, diplomacy is visible. They moved as traders, as researchers, as travelers. They listened. They remembered. They helped when they could, in small ways that did not draw attention. They never asked for anything directly. But they made note of who was unhappy. And they made note of what those unhappy species might need, if things were ever to change. By the time the Council read its declaration in Valethorn Prime, humanity had relationships, not alliances, because alliances are formal and formal things leave records, with 63 species who had their own reasons to want the Council's monopoly on power to end. Those 63 species had been told, in careful, deniable conversations, that if a door ever opened, they should be ready to walk through it. The message I sent from the platform, the 12 words that I pressed send on while Archon Thelavar watched me with his 4 pale eyes, that message opened the door. It triggered the deployment of the 4,000 ships from their caches. It activated the hidden supply lines. It initiated the communication networks. And it sent a simple, prearranged signal to representatives of 31 of those 63 species, telling them that the moment they had been quietly waiting for had arrived. On my way back to the human transport after the session, Oliver asked me again if I was sure. I told him I had been sure for 17 years. What I did not tell him, because he would understand it later, when there was time, was that my certainty was not about winning. I was not sure we would win, in any clean or simple sense. War between species is not a game that ends with a clear score and a handshake. What I was sure about was something simpler. I was sure that standing still and doing nothing was no longer survivable. I was sure that the Council's tolerance for humanity would expire eventually whether we acted or not. I was sure that Patricia Howell had been right when she wrote, in the very first paragraph of her 4,000-page document, that the only way to change a system built on the capacity for overwhelming force is to become something the system cannot overwhelm. I was sure because I remembered Shorvath. I remembered what 800 million people looked like as a number written on a file that the Council had sealed and filed and moved on from, as though it were nothing more than a budget entry. I had been sure since the day I saw that number. And now, at last, the door was open. The ships were moving. The network was alive. They thought war was the worst thing they could threaten us with. They forgot that some people have been quietly building the door and waiting for someone to knock. They came out of what they thought was empty space. The Council's advance fleet entered the Kareth corridor at 0400 station time, running in tight formation, 212 ships in the standard Council approach configuration, which placed the heavy cruisers at the front, the support vessels in the middle, and the long-range communication relays at the rear. It was a formation that had served the Council well across 800 years of military operations. It was efficient, well-tested, and thoroughly documented. I had read about it in Henry's long memory database. So had every commander under my authority. Captain Nina Ross, commanding the human fleet element designated Sweep 7, was watching the corridor on passive sensors from a position 11,000 kilometers off the Council fleet's port side. Her ship, a converted cargo hauler that now carried 8 rapid deployment batteries and a crew of 40, was one of 64 vessels arranged in a dispersed pattern that the Council's active sensors showed as exactly nothing. The asteroid field in the Kareth corridor was real. The asteroids were real. The mass signatures were real. The fact that 40 of those asteroids were not actually made of rock was a detail the Council had not yet discovered. Nina waited until the leading Council cruisers had passed into the midpoint of the corridor. She waited with the patience of someone who had learned, across 9 years of preparation and training, that timing was not a minor consideration. Timing was everything. Then she gave the order. The 40 converted platforms activated simultaneously. Their concealed weapon systems came online. Their drives lit up. And the corridor, which the Council fleet had entered expecting to be empty, suddenly contained 40 armed vessels in perfect firing position at point-blank range. I heard the engagement report from the bridge of my own command ship, the Unks Shorvath, 4 hours later. Nina's tone was the same she used when filing routine supply requests. First contact, Kareth Corridor, 0418 station time. Council advance fleet disabled or withdrawn. No human losses. Moving to secondary objectives. I wrote down the time and set the report aside. At the same hour, in 11 other locations spread across the Velhari Reach and the outer frontier, similar engagements were either concluding or beginning. The plan did not call for a single massive battle. A single massive battle was exactly what the Council expected and had prepared for. The Council's experience with opposition forces was that they massed, because massing felt like strength, because strength felt like safety. It was an entirely logical response to having a much smaller force. It was also entirely predictable. We did not mass. We dispersed. Our 4,000 ships operated in small, fast, autonomous groups that moved according to a shared strategic logic rather than centralized command. Each group had a defined objective and the authority to adapt their approach based on conditions on the ground. There were no long communication chains to the top of a hierarchy that would introduce delay. The captains made decisions. They made them fast. And they made them according to a set of principles that had been developed from 18 months of running the long memory database through every tactical simulation Henry's team could design. The Council's generals, when they began receiving engagement reports from their fleet commanders, did not understand what they were seeing. The pattern was unfamiliar. The human forces appeared in unexpected places, hit specific targets with surgical precision, and then dissolved back into sensor shadow before a response could be coordinated. They did not hold territory. They did not form defensive lines. They severed supply routes, disabled communication relays, and removed specific strategic assets from the board with the calm efficiency of a chess player who has spent a long time thinking about every possible position on every possible board. In the fourth engagement of the first day, a Council fleet moving to reinforce their position at the outer frontier found their route blocked. Not by warships, by a dispersed field of interdiction beacons that the human forces had deployed across 3 separate hyperspace transit lanes, activating the Vandermeer field and making those lanes unusable. The Council fleet turned to their secondary route. It was also blocked. Their tertiary route required a detour of 11 hours. By the time they arrived, the situation they had been rushing to reinforce no longer existed. The Council's losses in the first 40 hours were significant. 340 ships destroyed outright, 900 disabled and boarded or abandoned, 4 major supply corridors severed. 7 communication relay stations went dark, which meant that large sections of the Council's fleet were operating without real-time information from their command centers. Human losses were 12 ships. 11 of those were older vessels that had been assigned to diversion operations specifically because they were expendable. Aboard one of the Council vessels that was boarded during the second day of operations, a young soldier named Kale, conscripted from a small species called the Ithrel who had been members of the Council for 50 years but had never been given a seat that mattered, found himself standing at the end of a corridor watching 3 human boarding personnel walk toward him. He had been told, during his mandatory Council military training, that humans were violent by nature, poorly organized, and unlikely to follow civilized rules of engagement. He had been shown images from what the Council's historical records described as humanity's own internal conflicts, images selected specifically to emphasize chaos and aggression. He stood at the end of the corridor with his hands raised and he waited. The three humans looked at him. One of them, a woman with brown hair and a calm expression, who introduced herself as Lieutenant Paula Grant, asked him in passable Athrel whether he was injured. He said no. She asked whether there were other crew members aboard who needed medical attention. He said there were 2 in the engine compartment who had been hurt during the initial engagement. She sent one of the other personnel toward the engine compartment immediately. Then she looked at Kale and asked him, in a tone entirely free of hostility, where the ship's weapons locker was. They stripped the ship's weapons systems in under an hour. They checked that every crew member was physically safe. They left the communication systems intact. They left the life support systems intact. They left the food stores intact. Before they departed, Lieutenant Grant left a small case near the airlock. Inside it, Kale found medical supplies, a portable power cell for the damaged engine section, and a datapad loaded with what appeared to be the complete first volume of a collection of human literature translated into 8 languages, including Athrel. He sat in the corridor for a long time after they left. He had fought for a council that had conscripted him. He had fought against humans who had just made sure he was healthy and left him with books. He sent a message to his family. Then he sent a much longer message to an Athrel community representative whose contact information had quietly appeared on his personal comm device 3 months before the war, placed there by a network he had not known existed until now. The message said, "The door is open." Back in the Council's Central Command Center on Veilthorn Prime, Archon Thelavar was receiving reports. He was receiving them slowly, because the communication relays were down, and the reports that arrived were fragmented and inconsistent. His generals told him what they knew. It was not much. What they knew was that human forces were operating in at least 12 theaters simultaneously. What they knew was that the human forces were not behaving like any Tier 3 species military in the Council's historical records. What they knew was that their own forces, which outnumbered the human forces by a factor of nearly 6, had spent 40 hours being outmaneuvered with what could only be described as systematic patience. What they did not yet know was why. Thelavar demanded answers from his senior military staff. The answers he received were careful and professional and entirely unsatisfying. They told him the situation was developing. They told him they were adapting their response. They told him that the human military capacity was greater than preliminary assessments had indicated. They did not tell him that preliminary assessments had been based on what humanity allowed the Council to see. Later that evening, Veilthorn Prime kept a standard 32-hour day. A single transmission arrived from the human command. It was addressed to the Council's Central Operations Center, unencrypted, which meant it had been sent in a format that could be intercepted by any monitoring system in the region. It was intended to be intercepted. The message said, "Corridor 7 is ours now. Suggest you reroute your supply lines while you still can." It was signed with my name. Thelavar read it 3 times. His senior military advisor read it twice and said nothing for a long period. Then the advisor said, very quietly, that he believed the humans had been preparing for this for considerably longer than any previous intelligence assessment had suggested. Thelavar asked by how much. The advisor thought about it carefully. "Perhaps," he said, "by 17 years. The chamber was quiet for a moment. War, I had always believed, is not won with weapons. It is won with the understanding that the enemy does not yet know what they have started. The war had been running for 22 days when the signal came. It came on a channel I had not used in 3 years. The encoding was a format I had established personally, not through any official diplomatic system, and the fact that it arrived at all told me that the person on the other end had access to intelligence resources that most of the Council's own generals did not. I was in my private office aboard the Unks Shorvath when the alert appeared on my screen. I looked at it for a moment. Then I sent Oliver out and closed the door. The voice on the other end spoke English. It was slightly accented, and careful, and old. "Admiral Voss," the voice said. "My name is Archon Maruval. I represent no official council position in this communication. I am speaking to you privately, without authorization, and without the knowledge of my colleagues. I am speaking to you because I am the only member of the current council who voted against the declaration of war 3 weeks ago. I was the only vote. The record of that vote was sealed within 6 hours. I sat back in my chair. I remember reading about you, I said. You were the chair of the Minority Review Committee 14 years ago. You published a dissenting report on the Shorvith compliance action. There was a brief pause. You have done your research. I have had a long time. Yes, he said quietly. I suspect you have. Another pause. Admiral, I am going to ask you a direct question, and I am going to ask you to give me a direct answer, because I think direct answers are the only thing that has any value at this point. Go ahead. What do you want? I had been asked that question before. I had been asked it by analysts, by military strategists, by politicians in closed rooms who were trying to understand what model to plug me into so they could predict my behavior. Most of them were asking what territory I wanted, what resources, what formal acknowledgement of human superiority in some measurable category. I looked at my desk for a moment. On the edge of the desk, where I could always see it, I kept a small paper photograph. It was old, printed on physical paper rather than displayed on a screen, which made it slightly unusual in an environment where everything was digital. The photograph showed a city. It was a beautiful city, built along the curve of a river, with towers that caught the light in a particular way that made them look as though they were made of water. It was a city that no longer existed. It had been on Shorvith. A colleague of mine had taken that photograph. His name had been Daniel. He had traveled there on a cultural exchange program 24 years ago and had sent me the photograph with a note describing the music he had heard in the marketplace. He had said it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He said it felt like color had been translated into sound. Daniel had still been on Shorvith when the council's fleet arrived. I did not look at the photograph as a reminder of grief, exactly. I looked at it as a reminder of what I was doing this for, and why, and what it would mean if I was not careful and precise about the answer to the question I had just been asked. I want 3 things, I said to Maruval. And I want to be very clear that I am not negotiating the order or the substance of any of them. I am listening. First, the Council's tiered species classification system ends permanently. No species in the known galaxy is legally designated as less significant than another. Every species that currently holds a council seat holds a seat of equal standing. Every species that does not currently hold a seat is offered one. Maruval said nothing. Second, I continued. Compliance actions are prohibited. Permanently. Under any circumstances. No council fleet, no authorized council proxy force, and no coalition of member species acting under council authority may take punitive military action against a civilian population for any reason related to resource use, territorial activity, or failure to meet treaty obligations. Disputes go to a review body. They get resolved through process. They do not get resolved through 11 hours of destruction. The silence on the other end stretched out. Third, I said. Full accountability for Shorvith. Public. Detailed. With named responsibility. And a formal recognition, written, public, and permanently entered into galactic historical record, that what happened there was not a compliance action. It was a collective catastrophe. It needs to be called what it was. There was a very long pause. Admiral, Maruval said at last, what you are describing would effectively end the council as it currently exists. Yes, I said. You understand that 847 species have built their political and economic infrastructure around the council's existing structure. The disruption would be significant. I understand that, I said. I also understand that the current structure has spent 800 years telling smaller species that their lives are line items in a compliance budget. I am not particularly moved by arguments for the preservation of that structure. Maruval was quiet for a moment. There are members of the council who would accept significant concessions in exchange for a ceasefire. Expanded rights for Tier 3 and Tier 4 species. Formal apology protocols. Enhanced review processes. That is not what I asked for. No, he said slowly. It is not. I waited. If we meet your terms, he said at last, his voice careful and precise, will you stop? I looked at the photograph on the edge of my desk. At the city along the curve of a river. At the towers made of water light. At the evidence of something that had existed and been beautiful and had been erased by a decision made in a chamber not unlike the one I had been standing in 3 weeks ago. I will stop, I said, when it can never happen to anyone else again. Another long pause. That is a very difficult standard to meet. I know, I said. But it is the only one that matters. There was a quality to the silence that followed that I had not heard before in Maruval's voice. It took me a moment to identify it. Then I realized what it was. It was grief. Not the political kind, not the strategic kind. The real kind. The kind that lives in a person who has been watching something wrong happen for a very long time and has not been able to stop it and has had to carry the weight of that watching without being able to put it down. I voted against the Shorvith action, he said quietly. At the time, it was not even a formal vote. It was a chamber consensus. I was the only dissenting voice and they proceeded anyway. The report I published afterward was buried within a month. A pause. I want you to know that. I know it, I said. I have known it for a long time. It is part of why I am talking to you right now. You investigated me. I investigated everyone. You were the only one who had ever actually tried to stop it. Maruval took a long breath. I cannot promise you the terms you have outlined. I do not have the authority to promise them. What I can do is bring them to a group of council members who are beginning to understand that the alternative, continuing this conflict, is considerably more damaging to the council's long-term coherence than the reforms you are proposing. How many members are in that group? Currently, 41, he paused. That number is growing. I thought about that. 41 out of 847 was not a majority. But 41 was not nothing, either. Tell me something, I said. If I can, he replied. When you voted against the declaration 3 weeks ago. When you sat in that chamber and cast the only dissenting vote. What did you think was going to happen? The silence was very brief. I thought, he said, that you would come to the platform and beg. And that I would be ashamed. I did not say anything. I was not expecting the smile, he said quietly. Most people weren't. What did it mean, he asked. The smile. I have been thinking about it since. I looked at the photograph one more time. At the city that was gone. At the towers that had once caught the light in a way that made them look like water. It meant, I said, that for 17 years I had been waiting for the council to tell the truth about what it was. And when you finally did, all 847 of you, unanimous, no hesitation, I was not sad. I was not afraid. I was relieved. Because at least now we all knew exactly where we stood. I could hear him breathing. And where are we standing, Admiral? At the beginning, I said, of something different. If your 41 are willing. He said he would make contact again within 48 hours. He said it the way a man says something when he has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and has just been told that he can set it down. After he disconnected, I sat in my office for a while without moving. The ship hummed around me with its steady mechanical breathing, the sound I had lived inside for most of my adult life. Outside the hull, in the dark, 4,000 ships were moving through the known galaxy in directions that the Council could not fully track or predict. I picked up the photograph and held it for a moment. I thought about Daniel, and the music in the marketplace, and the way he had described it in a note that I had kept for 24 years. I thought about a woman named Patricia Howell sitting at a kitchen table with a pot of cold coffee and 4,000 pages of furious purpose building in her hands. I thought about Henry Cole in a hollowed asteroid 9 kilometers wide, watching ships take shape in the artificial light, believing in something he could not yet see. I put the photograph down. He said I was the most terrifying human he had ever met. I told him that was because he had only ever looked at us when we were afraid. He had never seen what we look like when we are not. 6 months is not a long time in the history of a civilization. It is long enough to end a war. It is long enough to dismantle the machinery of 800 years of unchallenged authority and begin replacing it with something new. It is long enough to watch the shape of the known galaxy shift in ways that none of the observers who had been predicting galactic politics for centuries had anticipated. I was standing on the observation balcony above the newly redesigned Grand Chamber of Valethorn Prime when the final delegation entered. The chamber had been altered in the months since I had sat on the small human platform at its center. The platform was gone. In its place was a floor-level arrangement of seats that curved in a wide oval, no elevated positions, no center of implied authority. The lighting had been changed too. It came from sources you could actually locate now, warm and steady, without the calculated dimness that had always made visitors feel smaller than they were. Oliver stood beside me on the balcony, the same way he had stood behind me 6 months ago when the charges were being read. He was still 26. He looked considerably older. All 847, he said quietly. And 19 new ones, I said. Species that the old council had classified as too primitive for membership. He looked at me. 19. The classification system required 500 documented years of hyperspace travel. We removed the requirement. The review committee found 27 species that had been excluded on that basis alone. 19 chose to join immediately. Oliver was quiet for a moment. That is a lot of change in 6 months. This is the easy part, I said. He looked at me sideways. The war was the easy part. The war was simple. It had clear objectives and measurable outcomes. What comes next, actually making all of this work, holding 866 species in a structure that is honest about power and honest about accountability, that is considerably harder. That is the work of decades. Below us, the chamber was filling. The new delegates were taking their seats, and there was something in the movement of it that felt different from every session I had watched in that room before. There was noise, a great deal of noise, voices in hundreds of languages, the particular sound of people who had been given something and were still deciding what to do with it. It was not orderly. It was not the dignified silence of the old council's opening ceremonies. It was, I thought, considerably more honest. Archon Maruval was seated in the lower section of the gallery, not on the floor. He had declined a floor seat, which he had every right to now, and chosen instead to observe from a position that made it clear he considered himself a witness to this rather than a participant in it. He was old and he looked tired, and he was watching the chamber fill with the expression of someone who has spent a very long time hoping for something and is now sitting in the middle of it and is not sure what to feel. I had spoken to him twice in the weeks following our first conversation. Both times had been brief and focused and entirely without the weight of the first call. He had been instrumental in bringing the 41 council members to the negotiating table. Those 41 had brought others. The momentum had shifted in ways that, even now, I found difficult to fully account for, not because I had not planned for it, but because there is a difference between planning for a thing and watching the thing actually happen. The formal cessation of hostilities had been signed 31 days after I first contacted Maruval. The terms were not everything I had asked for. They were close. The tiered classification system was ended, the compliance action prohibition was written into the founding charter of the new interspecies accord, and the formal accountability process for Shorvith had been opened. It would take years to complete, but it was open, and it was public, and it could not be sealed. I had accepted the terms. Not because they were perfect. They were not perfect. They would never be perfect. The history of what the council had done over 800 years could not be fully addressed in a negotiating session or a founding charter. What had happened to Shorvith could not be undone by a document, no matter how carefully written. But a door had been opened. And the question, now, was what would be built in the space beyond it. The human delegation's role in the new interspecies accord was something I had negotiated carefully. Several of the other species involved in the talks had expected, and in some cases hoped, that humanity would claim a position of primary authority. It was a natural assumption. We had fought the war. We had driven the change. In the logic of power, that usually meant you sat at the top of whatever came next. I had refused that outcome firmly and repeatedly. What I had accepted was a permanent seat, identical in standing to every other seat, and a specific mandate that I had written the language for myself. Humanity's role in the accord was to serve as what the charter called a historical integrity function, which, when translated out of diplomatic language, meant that our job was to remember. To keep and maintain the full public record of everything the old council had done and everything the new accord did. To be the species that noticed when patterns of old behavior began to reappear in new clothing. To be the uncomfortable voice in the room that asked, when comfortable decisions were being made, whether anyone had thought about what this would look like in 50 years. It was not a glamorous role. It was not the kind of role that produced ceremonies and statues. It was the kind of role that prevented Shorvith. The council had been built by species that had never been powerless. The oldest members, the most influential ones, had been traveling the stars since before humanity had fire. They had built their civilization from a position of strength, which meant that their understanding of power was the understanding of those who have always had it. They knew how to exercise it. They had never learned what it felt like to be on the other end of it. Humanity had learned it very well. That knowledge, the specific, lived understanding of what it means to stand on a small platform in a chamber designed to make you feel insignificant, to have your choices judged and your people's survival treated as a matter of policy compliance, that was not something you could teach in a political science seminar. It was something you carried in your body. It was something that shaped the way you looked at a room full of powerful beings deciding things about people who had not been invited to the conversation. And it was the thing that made us, in ways that had nothing to do with weapons or tactics, the most appropriate stewards of the Accord's integrity. The first chair of the Accord's Historical Review and Accountability Committee was a woman named Lena Barrow. She was 53 years old, a legal scholar who had spent her career working on interspecies rights frameworks in academic settings. She had never held a military rank. She spoke 11 languages. She had a reputation among colleagues for being impossible to rush, impossible to flatter, and almost impossible to disagree with once she had made up her mind about something, because she always arrived at her positions through such a careful process that arguing with her felt less like a debate and more like trying to argue with arithmetic. She was also from the Shorvith diaspora. Her grandmother had been one of the 11,000 survivors, people who had been off-world when the Council's fleet arrived. She had grown up in an Athrel refugee settlement, stateless, classified under Council law as the remnant population of a non-compliant world, which meant they had no formal legal standing and no right to apply for membership in any Council-recognized political entity. That classification had now been ended. The Accord's founding charter included a full recognition of diaspora populations from compliance action events, with automatic membership rights and a formal process for territorial claims. When Lena Barrow took her seat on the Accountability Committee on the first day of the Accord's operations, she placed a single item on the desk in front of her. It was a small recording device, old model, the kind that stored audio on a physical medium rather than digitally. She said it contained recordings her grandmother had made in the refugee settlement, recordings of the music she remembered from Shorvith. She said that every decision the committee made would be made in the presence of those recordings. She said it not dramatically but simply, the way you state a fact that requires no defense. No one objected. From the balcony, I watched the chamber continue to fill. Oliver was quiet beside me. Somewhere below, I could see Maruval in his gallery seat, watching. I could see the Athrel delegation finding their places. The Athrel had been council members for 50 years but had never been given real standing, and watching them settle into seats that were, for the first time, equal in every formal sense to the Velhari seats and the oldest species seats, was something I found difficult to look at without feeling a complex weight in my chest. The young Athrel soldier, Kale, Oliver had shown me his message traffic, the note he had sent to the community representative. The door is open. Kale was not in the chamber. He was back on his homeworld, which was currently in the early stages of electing its first genuine legislative body in 40 years. He had been discharged from council military service on the day the cessation was signed, along with every other conscripted soldier from a non-core species. He had sent one more message after his discharge. Not to the community representative. To the Human Military Command, addressed to Lieutenant Paula Grant. It said, "Thank you for the books." It said, "The first one I read was a novel about a woman who built something very slowly, across her whole life, and finished it just before she died, and no one knew what it was for until after she was gone." It said, "I think I understand that story better now." Paula Grant had written back. She said she was glad. She said the woman in the novel was named Eleanor. She said Eleanor had known exactly what she was building the whole time. Oliver had shown me that exchange without comment. I had read it twice and then set it aside and gotten back to work. The chamber was almost full now. The sound from below had reached a kind of critical mass, not chaotic, but alive. It was the sound of a thing that was actually happening, rather than the sound of a performance of a thing that had already been decided in private. Oliver looked at me. "Are you satisfied?" he asked. I had been thinking, while I watched the chamber fill, about the question of satisfaction. It was a word that implied a kind of conclusion, a state in which the work was done and the outcome was sufficient and you could rest. It was not a word that matched how I felt. What I felt was something more provisional than satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling you have when you have put down a very heavy thing you have been carrying for a long time, and your arms are still shaped around where the weight used to be, and your body is still calibrated for a load that is no longer there, and you are not sure yet what to do with the space you have recovered. Ask me in 50 years, I said. Oliver nodded slowly. He understood, I think, that this was not a deflection. It was an honest answer. 50 years was the minimum. 50 years was long enough to see whether the accord held when tested. Long enough to see whether the historical integrity function actually functioned, or whether it became, over time, a ceremonial position that people smiled at in meetings and ignored when it was inconvenient. Long enough to see whether the pattern that had produced the old council, the slow, patient consolidation of power in the hands of those who already had it, had been genuinely interrupted or had simply found new clothing. 50 years was long enough to know. I looked down at the chamber one more time. At the oval of seats filling with 866 species. At the warm light falling from sources you could actually locate. At Lena Barrow's committee seat, still empty, because she had not yet arrived for the day. At Maruval in the gallery, watching, carrying his own version of a long wait in his own way. I thought about Patricia Howell at her kitchen table with her cold coffee and her 4,000 pages of fury and careful thought. I thought about Henry Cole in the humming dark of Installation 7, watching ships take shape. I thought about Claire Vandermeer in her research station, publishing her findings openly, with no idea what they would eventually become part of. I thought about Daniel, and the city along the river, and the music in the marketplace. I thought about what it means to build something across years and years and years, never knowing whether you will see it finished, never knowing whether the foundation will hold, choosing every day to keep going anyway because the alternative, stopping, accepting, looking away, was something you had decided, once and finally, that you were not capable of. That was what they had never understood about us. The Council, with all its accumulated centuries and all its careful monitoring of Tier 3 species development, had never quite grasped the thing that was most essential to understanding humanity. We were not dangerous because we were violent. We were not dangerous because we were clever. We were not dangerous because we had spent 17 years building a military capability they had not seen coming, though we had. We were dangerous because we remembered. Every species that had ever stood on that small platform in the center of the Grand Chamber, every species that had been judged and charged and threatened and complied with, we remembered them. We carried them. We built them into the foundation of every decision we made, because we had learned, at great cost, that forgetting is not neutral. Forgetting is a choice. And the choice to forget is always made by those who benefit from the forgetting. We had decided, not once, not in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small daily decisions made by 1,000 ordinary people in laboratories and refugee settlements and hollowed asteroids and research stations across the known galaxy, that we were not going to be that. We were going to be the species that remembered. And the Accord, imperfect and new and fragile as it was, had been built on that decision. It carried that decision in its charter. It carried it in Lena Barrow's recording device. It carried it in the equal weight of 866 seats in an oval on a floor where no platform stood. It would need to be carried again, every day, for 50 years, and then 50 more, and then 50 more after that. That was not a burden. That was the work. I straightened up from the balcony railing. Below, the session was about to begin. The first session of the Interspecies Accord, in a chamber that had once been designed to make people feel small. They called us dangerous. They were right, but not for the reasons they thought. We were dangerous because we remembered. And we had decided, all of us, every last stubborn, grieving, furious one of us, that we would never stop.